Hi, and welcome to Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marianne Clements, a feminist writer, facilitator, activist, coach, and the initiator of Healing Solidarity. And in this conversation, I talk with Hitendra Solanki about his work on mindfulness, well-being, and self-awareness in humanitarian spaces, his vision for well-being clusters that help us connect the mental health of practitioners and communities, and why mindfulness and self-awareness could be key for sectorial change. So hi, and welcome back to Healing Solidarity. And I'm here with Hitendra Solanki. And we're going to talk about his work on well-being and well-being of aid workers and the well-being cluster and a few other things too, I think. So hi, Hitendra. It's great to have you here on Healing Solidarity. Do you want to just say hi to everyone and maybe a little bit about who you are?
I can. So thank you. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here. I think our discussions about sort of well-being, mindfulness, and how that sort of fits into everything, and some of the legacy work that we've done with the Transforming Surge Capacity program, may be of interest, and just to share some of the experiences that we've had there, and potentially look at moving forward a little bit more as well with how the whole idea of self-awareness through mindfulness practice can be useful, not only just for well-being, which obviously I do want to speak about, but also its implications for management, self-management, how it then impinges in the workplace itself. And off the back of the HHR conference just last week in Antwerp, where we were talking about organizational trust, that self-awareness to understand how we work, what's going on in our minds, what's going on emotionally, what's going on physically within us. Trusting ourselves is, I believe, the first step towards, how we create organizational trust as well. So it's an expansion, not just pigeonholing mindfulness in the well-being place, but also saying that, okay, there's implications on self-awareness, self-management, leadership, trust, and beyond that pigeonholed experience of well-being as the key aspect of mindfulness.
Sure. So can I just wind you back to say a little bit about who you are, what you do in the world, and how you come to have these different threads around mindfulness, around thinking about organizational trust, around some of the things you've already spoken to.
So we've been working with Action Against Hunger for just over 10 years, and we'll be leaving very shortly, actually. But with Action Against Hunger, one of the pieces of work that we were doing at that point is looking at transforming surge and the whole idea of surge capacity. I used to work on the operational team, doing a lot of the operational sort of programming, proposal writing, partnerships and programs. But as part of the work that the START Network were working on under the DEP program, which is the Disasters Emergency Preparedness Program, there was an opportunity to work on this Transforming Surge Capacity program. And as we considered how to improve humanitarian surge with efficiency, effectiveness, coherence, for example, to essentially put the boots on the ground very quickly and to do that in a much more effective way, one of the things that really became apparent, especially right from the beginning when we had the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review, which was precursor to the business case for DFID to put forward the DEP program, was that there was no mention whatsoever about well-being. If you read that document and you read the business case that DFID put together for DEP, there was actually absolutely no mention of well-being for humanitarian aid workers. And at that point, it just made sense that if we are trying to improve humanitarian response and ultimately create resilience for our beneficiaries, then one of the things that we really had to look at is the resilience and the well-being of our own staff, which seemed to be a massive omission both in the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review as well as DEP's program, business program. So it was put forward to the START Network at the time through our little consortia led by ActionAid at the time. And ultimately, we did get funded to do a program. It was $2.5 million to do a program for the Transforming Surge Capacity program, and a tiny little sliver of that came our way at Action Against Hunger to do what was ultimately developed as the Mindfulness and Wellbeing Program.
Right.
And as part of my own background as a mindfulness trainer, trained from the University of Bangor and a little bit with the University of Massachusetts in the States, the idea of shifting an emphasis from the treatment-based modality to preventive one, very much looking at the preparedness which was inherent in the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review. The idea of actually using mindfulness there to prepare our aid workers became very much, a focus of the program, and emphasizing on that preparedness and preventative aspect. So I took the MBSR, or the mindfulness-based stress reduction training that I had been provided from Bangor and Massachusetts, and as part of the mindfulness and wellbeing component, the idea was to try and see what would happen with our aid workers if we were priming them to become self-aware. And the essence of that, the bottom line of that was really that, well, okay, if aid workers can be aware of their thinking, their emotions, their physical sensations, all these precursors to stress building up within the body and then affecting the mind, if they can notice that much more earlier down this journey from good health to potentially mental illness, if they catch themselves a little bit earlier, they might be able to mitigate the effects of stress, anxiety, and deal with it much more skillfully. And so over the 3 years of the program, part of my work was to train cohorts in mindfulness, developing certain materials. Some of them were audio and visual materials as well, so we're looking at that, and running a whole series of mindfulness-based stress reduction trainings within the Philippines, in Bangkok as well, in Thailand, and in the UK, with cohorts from Pakistan also coming in to do that training. So that was the essence of my background. So I shifted from the operational side to do this particular program over three and a half years, actually, in the end, which finished in 2018, around sort of March, April time. But I'm still doing the legacy work for that, because there was quite a few things that had been set up. And one of them being the wellbeing cluster as well, which we can talk about. But essentially, that's my background as a mindfulness trainer, as a humanitarian aid worker, and sort of bringing those two together to see how we can actually support our aid workers, both mentally and physically as well, through mindfulness practice.
And I'm interested to hear what you learned from doing those trainings through that 3.5 years of the program. Like, what impact did it seem to have? What did you learn about delivering it? I don't know, where did it work? Where didn't it work?
Goodness, have you got 3 days?
Not quite.
There was a huge amount of learning. I think, very much right from the inception of how you elaborate what mindfulness is, was a challenge, I believe, in the sector, and just bringing that in. So, working with a consortium of partners for this particular project, and because we had to develop a set of trainings, and mindfulness was one component of that training, how it would fit into usual trainings that you might provide, when people are going away on, some sort of training programs, and you think, well, okay, this is quite didactic and this is quite traditional in its training. And then you come across mindfulness and you say, well, how do you squeeze that in? Because you've got something very experiential here, which doesn't just neatly fit into a pigeonhole of other trainings. You can't just provide a facilitator's guide, for example, and say, right, get on with it, because the trainer themselves need to be very much embodied in the practice, to be very authentic about the practice. And that takes time. And you can't just do training of trainers training with mindfulness, because you need to give them space and time to actually develop that practice. So there were certain challenges of just how you introduce mindfulness into the sector, how you then provide that training in a credible, authentic way that maintains the integrity of the practice itself and the course, for example. But also just conveying the idea that mindfulness is something that takes time. It takes spaciousness. It's not a pill. It's not a quick fix, and it's not a tick box exercise that we've done this training and then suddenly you're armed and dangerous with self-awareness. But it is about, one, recognizing what it is, doing a set of trainings and giving that time and energy and that space for aid workers to do that training, and then maintaining that training over time and nurturing that self-awareness over time as well. So one of the challenges was, well, we had, say, a 5-day training, how do you squeeze an experiential course into that 5-day training, which was impossible. So I had to replicate and in parallel do a whole extensive series of MBSR trainings, which would take 5 to 6 days at a time. And then also supplement it with audio-visual recordings that I'd made as an introduction to mindfulness as well, to maintain that integrity. So things were pretty self-contained if people were not able to come to the face-to-face trainings, for example. So there are challenges inherent in the fact that it is experiential. It needs time and space, and plugging that into a very fast-moving. We don't have any time. We can't afford to have, resources to book a room, for example. So can you do something very quickly? And there is still a bit of teething to see how that can be developed. And so part of the legacy work that I have is to see how we can develop mindfulness practices that not just fit into the sector itself, but how do we also advocate for the well-being, the humanitarian sector, I should say, to actually give our staff time to build that resilience in, and not just think that they've got to catch this resilience while they're trying to catch the train for the next emergency. So, yeah, there is a lot of challenges there. And in saying that, one of the wonderful things is that right at the beginning, there did seem to be much more of an apprehension to what mindfulness was, the idea of how it could benefit. But with time, also with the level of evidence that's out there in terms of scientific evidence, for example, anecdotal evidence, the papers that are out there as well, in terms of the effects, the positive effects it has on the psychological makeup that you have, but also physically, has meant that it has turned a corner, and there is a lot more requests coming my way, for example, and I know many more inquiries into mindfulness with other practitioners, for example, from the well-being and from the humanitarian sector. Yeah. So yeah, it's turned a corner definitely, but it's been a bit of an uphill struggle.
Mm-hmm. It occurs to me that when you talk about surge, I think when we talk about humanitarian surge, we're talking about where we need people to get somewhere quickly. It seems like that's the kind of antithesis of something that takes time to develop and involves reflection. So I can totally imagine how there's a challenge in there. And so I'm wondering, were you trying to equip people who might then be sent in future to emerging situations, or were you trying to do it, in sandwiched in between?
So precisely. I mean, the focus really was on saying, well, okay, can we provide that preparedness and preventative training so that people are skilled and self-aware when they go into emergencies where potentially it is overwhelming and it is stressful, that it may cause anxiety, that there may be difficult traumatic incidents, there may be critical incidents, there may be vicarious trauma where it's just cumulative over time. And so the idea was really to prime people for that.
So, Hitendra, I wanted to ask you a bit about the wellbeing cluster work that you've done, I think as part of the same project in the Philippines. I think it's an extension of it to some extent. Do you want to share a bit about that and how it's working and what it's all about?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most positive outcomes of the entire Transforming Surge Capacity project was the development of a wellbeing cluster. And so I've got to be careful how I explain this cluster and why I even call it a cluster, why we decided to call it a cluster, actually. So one of the first naiveties that I had in the project, was that I thought I'd go in and just talk about mindfulness, focus on the whole mindfulness aspect, develop mindfulness hubs and little clusters of mindfulness practice with aid workers, and then we would do some sort of longitudinal research to follow through to see the effectiveness over time. As I was focused on the actual mindfulness itself and really sort of plugging in the idea of mindfulness, it really became apparent that there was no way to actually plug this into a well-being framework. So in essence, my naivety is that, okay, I'll take the mindfulness, we'll do the practice, and then we'll offer it to organizations to put it into their well-being frameworks within organizations. And then it would be within this sort of organizational or sector framework of well-being within the sector. And I really was genuinely naive about that. I honestly thought that, okay, that will just plug in and it'll be nice, neat, and beautiful sort of mosaic of well-being in the sector, only to realize that most organizations didn't really have anything in terms of a well-being framework that was coherent or structured in a purposeful way. And then as I looked widely more in the sector, as the project was rolling out across these various countries in Southeast Asia and in the UK, just to realize, well, actually, there is no real well-being framework. I can't just plug it in. We can't just have a preventative aspect and a treatment-based aspect. In some ways, we actually need to develop a framework. And that was quite a huge sort of revelation for me. And the direction of the program itself, for myself, changed drastically to realize, well, okay, if I create this, how does it fit in? And we've got to develop ways for it to fit in. And talking to, numerous, dozens, if not, a couple of hundred chief executives and senior management within organizations over 3.5 years, through conferences, through one-to-ones, through various trainings that were delivered over time, you would deliver all these killer statistics, the statistics from the Antares Foundation talking about 30% of their staff coming back with PTSD, the Guardian survey, which is very much quoted all the time, saying that 79% of aid workers have mental health issues, 93% say it's related to aid work. And you suddenly realize, well, okay, all these statistics are out there. The problem is so in your face. It's so blindingly obvious. Why aren't these organizations, these chief executives, why aren't they doing these things? And of course, I understand not having a go at them, but you realize that there's so many priorities and so many issues that we're dealing with, often very fast running because one emergency then lurching to another crisis, lack of resources, that somehow well-being was not established or prioritized as much as it should be. And then you think, well, okay, if it's not working from a top-down way, where you'd think that with these statistics, people would say, oh my God, we've got to do something. We've got a major crisis here, that we should really establish something that is much more concrete, shift the emphasis to preventative to stop people getting to that point. What can we do? And if it's not happening from top-down angle, then perhaps we can start looking at it from another angle. I thought it would be much more difficult to set up a platform and say, well, let's look at potentially getting a cluster of organizations forming a platform. So rather than a mindfulness hub or a mindfulness platform, why don't we look at a well-being platform where we have multi-stakeholders involved? And multi-stakeholders would be NGOs, local NGOs, INGOs. You'd have the local government involved. You would have academia involved to make sure that there's credibility in the evidence-based collection and the learning. You would have faith-based organizations. You would have the UN involved, potentially through UN OCHA, for example. And you would potentially have a lot of community-based organizations, women's groups, and the community involved as well. So there would be a great sort of reciprocity between the aid workers and the local communities as well. So that if we do something together, you don't just elevate aid workers in isolation of the beneficiaries, but contextually in a local way. If you have a local cluster of these multi-stakeholders there, then you would elevate communities and the aid community together. So the idea was that, okay, if you can create a well-being platform, you would share, pool resources, expertise, you would create dynamic environments of learning. You could also make sure that there's a burden share of costs, for example. So, for example, the smallest NGO may not be able to afford the training, but if you've got a larger NGO supplying information or a person, for example, to deliver the training in a pro bono way, for example, or at very limited costs, you could then actually bring in these communities to actually do some training as well and share that particular knowledge. We could also then start looking at modalities of training. So if you have the aid workers working with universities and psychology departments, for example, we could start looking at humanitarian well-being in a much more credible way, much with a lot of scientific integrity as well. And so bringing everyone together, clustering them all together was the idea. How do you do that? you've got a challenge there. So I thought, okay, let's try and focus on the Philippines at that time. A lot of my work was in the Philippines. And through a period of potentially about 9 months to a year, discussing the idea, it's one of these wonderful things where on the back of an envelope, or in my case, in a sort of dog-eared notebook, you start drawing out a bit of a diagram and say, well, okay, here's a circle. Who do you put into the circle? What do you get out of the circle to help communities and aid workers? Very simple, nothing, rocket science based about it at all. You think, well, okay, let's create a little cluster of organizations. Selling that idea took a while. As I said, it took almost a year to do that idea. But what was wonderful was that because the need was so great, people at the coalface, people on the ground in the Philippines in that particular area, having constant typhoons, the danger of an earthquake in Manila, for example, the idea that you're constantly being prepared and on a regular basis having these emergencies, people were already primed that something needed to be done. And so I suddenly found myself with a much more receptive base than I did with the aid workers and the chief executives, for example, and wanting to actually do something and share something. And it was just a wonderful experience where people, I invited virtually everybody in the community to come along. And then bit by bit, from meeting to meeting, we decided to get operational. And the next thing we knew, we were saying, well, okay, what do we want to call this? And do we call it the Wellbeing Hub or the Wellbeing Platform? And the idea came about that a great benign provocation to the UN system to take wellbeing much more seriously is to call it a cluster and then confuse everyone in the sector. Now, what's this wellbeing cluster? Is it to do with the UN system or not? And the idea was benign, and the idea was to get the UN to be around the table as we were discussing the formation of this group, this hub. We ended up getting UN OCHA in the Philippines to participate in the operational meetings. And then we actually found two key local organizations, two wonderful organizations, Senvisnet and the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation in Cebu in the Philippines. We said, okay, you know what, we will take on the burden. We will take on the responsibility as lead. And then with a little bit of money from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy in the Philippines at the time, and a little bit of money from Action Against Hunger, we primed the development of a secretariat and a management to manage these sort of ragtag group of agencies and stakeholders to form a cluster, developing a sort of principles, a vision statement, setting up an accord of what we wanted to achieve. And just, these sort of romantic stories of things from the back end of an envelope suddenly taking form, it was just a humbling experience that last July. We formally launched the Wellbeing Cluster in the Philippines, a 2-day launch. We've celebrated our first anniversary. And in fact, we had the celebrations this week in the Philippines. And we now have an operational Wellbeing Cluster that is actively looking at developing in a joint way how to essentially look after humanitarian well-being, the well-being of communities, but doing so in a very localized context. And so the model itself of a well-being cluster is to say, okay, let's create little nodes in areas where these are needed, such as the Philippines, where there is frequent recurrent emergencies. And then that learning, let's see if we can replicate that in other areas as well. So we're potentially looking at the replication of a cluster in Pakistan now as well, and also looking at replication of a wellbeing cluster in a different shape or form in the UK as well, which would be more to do with advocacy and learning, for example. So a long story short, the wellbeing cluster was really to create this platform as a grassroots movement, but also as a model to potentially scale up, replicate in other areas. And my own sort of opinion, my own personal vision, which I know is shared with the community of the team that are part of the Wellbeing Cluster in the Philippines, is that this could be a way of, one, having a very cost-effective, localized approach to well-being and mental health well-being in particular, with communities and aid workers on the ground. And that model itself could then be developed as part of humanitarian architecture globally as well. So if you take that learning, the first year that we've had an operation, if we can share that with Pakistan, hopefully next, and in the UK, we could actually start replicating this as a cost-effective, highly beneficial, effective, well-being focused, mental health focused entity that changes the humanitarian architecture for the better in terms of well-being. So yeah, long story short.
Yeah, it's an exciting vision, Hitendra, and I love the fact that you're thinking about how it might be usefully applied elsewhere, but in a way that's appropriate to a context. I guess I'm wanting to ask, do you think the model's only applicable to situations where there are regular emergencies, or do you think it could also be replicated? I know you talked about the UK and thinking about advocacy. Is there anything specific about the model to sort of an emergency context, or actually could it fit in kind of more development context? I guess I'm thinking, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. So one of the things I didn't mention in the previous question is that the cluster is designed to support in the emergency scenario, for example. It's to support people in sort of peacetime where there's no crisis currently taking place, is to prepare them for pre-deployment. And then to support them during deployment, for example, because you've got the cluster embedded in the community, and then post-deployment to do learning and to do follow-ups as well, just in case somebody is affected, etc. And then to take that learning, put it back into the loop. Now that's very great for a sort of humanitarian response cycle, the pre-deployment, during and after. But one of the aspects that we discussed as well is that if you've got that pool of resources and expertise existing already as a loose body, then there are implications of doing this as part of development work as well, or in essential chronic situations as well within the country. So in the Philippines, for example, there is unfortunately a huge drug epidemic, and which is affecting a lot of youth there. And the social workers as part of the Department of Health and Welfare, for example, they're being affected by what they're seeing as well. And because the Department of Health is involved, and the Department of Health and Wellbeing is Health and Welfare, I should say, is involved in the Philippines. Part of what we're trying to do is to say, well, okay, these clusters aren't just there for emergency response, and they don't just pop up like the UN clusters pop up. This would be an entity that exists, and that pool of expertise can be used for ongoing chronic crises within the country as well. So absolutely, it's not it differs completely from the UN cluster. The word cluster was only used just to annoy the UN system to get them on board with the well-being, but it is to do with a presence to support mental health within the country, regardless of whether it's an emergency situation or a chronic development situation. So yeah, absolutely.
Right.
The second part of the question, using about replication in other ways. Absolutely, I think whilst the wellbeing cluster model is to be very, very localized and contextual, so it's relevant to needs of the community, the traditions, the culture, the climate there, for example. The learning from that particular cluster, if we develop other clusters, is that you share this, so it becomes a greater network, from a regional network to a global network potentially, if things sort of move that way. But from the international aspect, the cluster, the idea for a cluster in the UK is based around the fact that, okay, we don't have typhoons and earthquakes here in the UK, for example. However, we do have a hub of learning here in all the various universities that are doing work on humanitarian well-being, for example. We have a hub of NGOs, even in London. And we have a lot of the key donors here that influence development globally as well. Now, if these international organizations based in London, for example, replicate a well-being hub here, or a well-being cluster here, what we can do is have a different focus. And that focus could be that, as I mentioned, advocacy. How can we, one, work together, pool some of the resources that we have together? How can we advocate for change potentially within the sector itself in the practices that we have? How can we, more importantly, advocate for change to put well-being and mental health issues firmly in place with the donors as well? So for a logical sequence here and a link, you might say that if you can provide well-being to our aid workers, the impact that they make in delivering programs for the impact that we want to make for our beneficiaries is going to be greater. Because currently, if you've got 79% affected by mental health, according to The Guardian, if you've got 30% affected by PTSD, according to the Antares Foundation, and some of my own research that we did in the START Network Wellbeing Survey, were revealing that about 48% had a threat to their own lives. You think, well, if half of your staff are being worried and anxious about the threat to their own lives, how can you make the impact to beneficiaries with that level of mental health issue going on? So if we can ask donors and say, well, we would like you to maybe consider this particular issue, fund this particular issue, and just like we talk about NPAC and the admin costs for organizations, what if we were able to embed a few percentage points of cost to a dedicated line on mental health and well-being, or welfare of staff, and that runs through so that we can actually then not stretch ourselves as organizations, but actually have some money coming in to help us provide much more effective staff, which will add greater impact. And that's what the donor wants. So, a wellbeing cluster here in the UK could do that sort of advocacy. And also with the universities and with some of the work that I also do at university, at London South Bank University, we're trying to create a wellbeing, a humanitarian wellbeing platform at the university, and having many universities, both in the Philippines, for example, and in the UK, working together on issues, we could actually then create wellbeing research that adds to the quality of wellbeing research being done for humanitarians, and then globally sharing that knowledge across the sector as well.
Yeah, great. I love your vision with that, Hitendra. I want to ask you one more question before we close, and it's kind of if you were to take a step back from the specific, really interesting things you've been working on, and just think about your perspective on the kind of humanitarian sector as a whole, and then your own expertise around mindfulness, around well-being, around advocating and researching about some of this stuff. Like, what's your vision for how things could change and how we could be really taking this stuff on and implementing it?
So for there's always that fear that you end up evangelizing mindfulness, and there is unfortunately a lot of information out there that almost sells it as a panacea for all ills. I don't advocate for it being a panacea for all ills. It has to be done in a particular way, and it has to be done mindful, no pun intended, as a way of looking after our staff, but not, releasing latent traumas, etc. It has to be done at a particular time, and you've got to have qualified people, very much doing this. For me, I do want to be an advocate for mindfulness and to do it in a really credible way with integrity. It has to be done that way. And unfortunately, the mindfulness sector globally is a bit like the Wild West. There's a lot of good stuff going on and a lot of not so good stuff going on as well in the name of mindfulness. If we can have a credible approach to mindfulness, and this is where the universities could come in and to really support that, to make sure that it's done in a robust scientific way and it's credible. I genuinely believe that the aspect of self-awareness that is developed and nurtured by mindfulness has major implications across life itself. And in terms of aid work, for example, it's not just the well-being aspect, as I mentioned before. It has implications for managers to be aware of themselves. Again, I talk about meta-awareness, for example, that is nurtured by self-awareness through mindfulness. That meta-awareness, becoming aware of what's going on in your thoughts, in your emotions, for example. We've heard about emotional intelligence, and that wonderful book by Daniel Goleman 20 years ago was sort of a major sort of tsunami in how organizations were looking at their managers, and also physically what's going on. That self-awareness has the power of actually really changing the way we operate within the sector. So from a well-being angle, you can self-manage yourself better, you can manage others better as well, potentially. And there's a huge amount of evidence to showcase that. There's something called the Singapore study, which was done, that showed that if you have a trait of mindfulness within you as a supervisor, that your employees or your people that you supervise are reacting much more positively to you as a manager. Their workload and their efficiency increases as well, and their state of contentment also is improved as a result of that. Decision making as well. We trialed a decision making workshop recently as well. A lot of learning from that. Still some teething issues on how to actually to promote that within the sector, but there is evidence to say that self-awareness can improve your decision making vastly as well. The organizational trust we talked about at the conference, the HHR conference, for example, in Antwerp just recently. The ability to really understand yourself and trust yourself is the precursor to then building that trust amongst your colleagues and trusting you and making those decisions or leading in a mindful way, for example. So the implications for the sector of self-awareness are huge. And it goes down to potential standards that we already have. So we've talked about the core humanitarian competency framework. One of the things that I've been in dialogue a little bit with the CHS Alliance over time is that we have a core competency on self-awareness, but how do we actually, one, recognize that self-awareness? Do we nurture that self-awareness? Do we maintain that self-awareness? Do we just expect it to be there, or can we actually do something about it? And mindfulness is a way that can actually allow you to build and nurture that self-awareness as a competency, which is already there as a standard. If we look at the Commitment 8 within the CHS, the Core Humanitarian Standard, if we are effectively trying to improve our aid workers as well, then mindfulness has an actualizing effect of really getting people to understand themselves and then to be more skillful in the way they articulate themselves as well. So the aspects of mindfulness for not only well-being, but also leadership, decision-making, the trust within organizational sort of environments is profound. And, we talk about well-being directly. The evidence for how mindfulness can help anxiety, depression, trauma is compelling. The evidence is out there. It's incredibly compelling. Without even, putting statistics out there, the fact that it is so compelling is one of the reasons why it's so mainstream now in the world. Everyone hears about the Headspace app, for example. Everyone hears about, mindfulness in their sort of regular sort of reads and magazines, for example. It is now so much mainstream because of all the science and the evidence that it is so positive out there. So the benefits for the humanitarian sector are profound. And if we can do this in a skillful way, if we can do this in a credible way, if we can do this in a way that the sector takes notice, not just saying, oh, it's a tick box exercise, but really gives it time and space to help our workers develop this quality, the implications for changing environments within our organizations and the impact, I believe, for our beneficiaries will be greatly improved as a result. So that's my advocacy, and I really hope I've not been evangelizing about mindfulness.
Thanks, Hitendra. I guess that's one question was left for me, so I think I'll just ask it now, and it's about kind of the origins of mindfulness, because I think we're talking about kind of a secular mindfulness in terms of how you're implementing it in these projects and programs. Do you just want to speak briefly to kind of the origins and of that, and how you think about them in your work?
So that's a really interesting question, because that question has come up one or two times, because previously, there's so many preconceptions about meditation in general, and mindfulness being a form of meditation gets caught up in preconceptions, misconceptions, apprehensions as well. yes, it does have a provenance in Eastern contemplative practices. But what I would very much stress is that every faith has had some sort of contemplative practice before. The way it's taught within the sector, the way I've been sort of trained within universities, is a secular approach. And an interesting aspect right at the beginning was, well, how do we bring this in when we've got, for example, in Transforming Surge Capacity program, we had a focus on the Philippines, which will be predominantly a Catholic country, in Pakistan, which is predominantly a Muslim country, and in Bangkok, where it's a predominantly Buddhist country, and in the UK, where there's a multicultural and multi-faith environment. I had my own sort of naivety as well, thinking, well, okay, maybe we've got to slightly change things for each of these audiences. But one of the most fascinating things that I found, at least from my experience, and this is after about 14 MBSR trainings that we did during the actual program itself, and countless other introduction to mindfulness sessions and drop-in sessions that we did, is that because, and this is the crux of the matter, because mindfulness is about paying attention, it's about being present, it is inherently a human quality. It's not a monopoly that is in one faith or another faith or time or culture or race. It's a human quality. And when you are there with people who really want to understand themselves better, and you essentially explain to them that we're all mindful to some degree or another, and we're all mindless to some degree or another, and this is just simply a practice, just like physical exercise. If you do some repetitions, this muscle's going to get stronger. In the same way that if you have a repetition of training the mind, your mental capacity will develop as well. And that simplicity of saying, well, it's a human quality and we're all able to nurture it, and that can give you clarity of understanding yourself and potentially your faith in the world around you, that can be very powerful. And what I actually found was that where I thought there may have been an issue, there wasn't an issue. And virtually every environment that I did the training in, with virtually every cohort from whatever faith, nationality, tradition, were open to the idea. And there was absolutely no problem at all. Where there is a problem is where people still are stuck in those preconceptions and don't want to go past it. And I think with time, as people understand that it is a human quality that you're nurturing, and it is secular and it's open to all human beings, then people will start realizing that it's not sort of mis-selling faith or, using particular techniques to try and change person's belief systems or anything like that. It's nothing like that. It's simply being human. That's all it is.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Hitendra. That's a really good grounding in what we're talking about. It's really useful. Thanks so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed it. And I think, you've got great ideas that can be really beneficial to some people listening and to the sector in general. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I wish you all the best. And we'll stay connected, I'm sure.
Thank you very much for your time, Marianne, as well. And thanks for everyone who's going to listen to this as well. Thank you. Thanks.
You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Hitendra Solanki, and this is Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to spend a little more time with the ideas and suggestions we discussed in this talk or in any of the others in this conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of the conference and get access to recordings and resources to help you go deeper with these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more.